Well, as we've discussed, there's been this boom and bust cycle. So now we're in kind of a bust cycle in terms of hiring and promotions. But sure as night follows day, at some point, we'll be back in the boom. There'll be either a new administration or maybe even a new Secretary of State, because under George W. Bush, we had two very different Secretaries of State, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. And under Powell, the Foreign Service grew dramatically, and under Secretary Rice, not so much. So even if the president stays the same, if there's a new Secretary of State, things could change dramatically. And when they do, either because, America comes to its senses, or because things happen overseas where it's obvious that the Foreign Service needs to be out there, then, promotions will pick up, and it'll be the perfect time to have already passed the Foreign Service written and oral exams and to be on the list. Because, 7 or 8 years ago, we hired almost 800 people one year. And typical year is maybe 300, and maybe 2017 might be 100, but now is the time, to take the Foreign Service test and try to get on the register, we call it, the list of people eligible to be brought into a Foreign Service Officer Orientation Program. So the competition is still there, and so you need to pass the test, and a lot of people, you pass it once with a certain score, and then you go right back in and take it again to try to pass it again with a slightly higher score. So.
This book talks about the Foreign Service as an institution, as a profession, what diplomats do professionally, what makes them professionals, and as a career. And it's a unique work in that sense, in that it takes these 3 points of view of the service. As an institution, we're talking about the Foreign Service as it has existed since 1924, and its roots even further back into the 19th century, and looking forward to what the Foreign Service is going to become. It's the people who are there now, their predecessors and their successors, and the mission that endures. As a profession, the Foreign Service is it's unusual. It's not a profession like law or medicine, where there is an exam to pass, the body of knowledge that you have to master, and a credential that you have to obtain. The Foreign Service or diplomacy is an open profession, like journalism. It's open to amateurs. You don't have to get credentialed. To be a senior diplomat, you only need to be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. There really aren't any other credentials. To apply for the Foreign Service, you have to be an American citizen. You have to be over the age of 21 and under the age of 59 and a half. But you don't have to have language skills. You don't have to have a college degree, although most people do. You don't have to have lived abroad, although many do. Many have that experience. It's really very open. And yet, there is a professionalism about the job. You have to know, you have to master certain kinds of knowledge, and much of this you pick up after you begin. And you have to understand a kind of unwritten canon of ethics. Diplomacy only works if you're honest with the people that you deal with, the foreigners that you deal with, and you're candid with the Americans that you deal with. You have to be honest and candid, or you will not be doing your job, and it won't work. Then we talk about the Foreign Service as a career, what it takes to get in, what it takes to get ahead, to get promoted, and how assignments work, how you get around from one post to another and go through the checkpoints that you need to go through to advance to senior levels, to gain responsibility. That's what Foreign Service officers and specialists all want. They want promotions so that they have bigger jobs with more responsibility. A desire to take on responsibility is a feature of members of the Foreign Service.
And I would say this is very much an insider's guide to the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service is not well known in America, and unless you've really been in it, it's hard to understand how it works. And so between us, we have decades in the Foreign Service, and I just left it. So it's very much up-to-date, authoritative, and it's also candid. This is not a, the State Department website, promotional brochure. This gives the good and the bad and the ugly, because it's very hard to get in the Foreign Service. So we frankly don't want anyone coming in who doesn't understand that you need to spend 2/3 of your career overseas and all these other things. So it's both good for the service and good for the person to really understand what you're potentially getting into. And the reviews of the book so far, the Foreign Service Journal said it was a definitive book, and General David Petraeus, who's well known for one of the most brilliant military officers of our time, calls it the classic work on the Foreign Service. So we're very proud of it. A lot of work went into it. It's up to date, and we're great fans of it. Diplomats are one of the oldest professions, not the oldest profession, but one of the oldest, and no matter what happens during the President Trump's tenure, diplomats are going to remain. And if you want someone trained and skilled with the languages and the cultural sensitivity out representing the United States, then that's the Foreign Service. I was in the military, and it's true that the U.S. military will step in if there's a void, and they'll do their best, but it's best to have trained civilians doing this work.
Yeah, I think I have forgotten now which four-star said it, but if there are fewer diplomats,
We're going to need more bullets.
Right.